Was Churchill a racist, authoritarian mass murderer, or a war hero who led Britain to victory in World War II? Let's have a look at his legacy and controversy surrounding his character. On May 10, 1940, as German forces surged to Western Europe, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister at Britain's moment of greatest peril. The army was retreating, France was collapsing, and many in Churchill's own party doubted him, haunted by past failures like Gallipoli. Yet Churchill promised only blood, toil, tears, and sweat. A stark call to endurance. More threatening than German bombs were voices within his own war cabinet, particularly Lord Halifax, who urged negotiating peace through Mussolini. Churchill resisted fiercely, warning that surrender would only mean subjugation, not salvation. During a critical week in May, he turned the tide in cabinet debates, declaring that Britain must fight on, even if it meant death on British soil. He told the cabinet, "If this Long Island story of ours is to end, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground." His unwavering defiance rallied his ministers, and soon the nation. His speeches during the Blitz, especially "We Shall Never Surrender," were more than just morale boosters. They were signals to allies and enemies alike. In those pivotal days, Churchill cemented his role not just as a wartime leader, but as the voice of Britain's refusal to yield. And it was the critical first step that needed to be made in the Allies' eventual march to victory. Central to Churchill's hero image is the Battle of Britain, a turning point in World War II. In the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe launched a massive aerial campaign to destroy the Royal Air Force, a necessary prelude to the planned invasion of Britain. Churchill's speeches steeled national resolve, most memorably his tribute to RAF pilots. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Yet behind the stirring rhetoric stood the strategic genius of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding and Air Vice Marshal Keith Park. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding was a master of resource management. Aware that Britain's fighter strength was limited, he prioritised preservation over reckless engagement. During the fall of France, Dowding opposed Churchill's repeated demands to send more squadrons across the Channel, arguing that Britain could not afford to lose aircraft needed for its own defence. This stance brought him into direct conflict with Churchill, who was eager to support France militarily. Dowding's refusal, deeply unpopular at the time, proved prescient. Had more squadrons been committed and lost in France, Britain would have faced the Battle of Britain dangerously weakened. Instead, thanks to Dowding's foresight and cautious stewardship, Fighter Command entered the battle with just enough strength to prevail. His strategic restraint arguably saved Britain from defeat at its most vulnerable moment. Under Dowding's leadership, Britain developed the revolutionary Dowding system, an integrated air defense network that combined radar detection, ground observers, radio communication, and centralized command and control. This allowed RAF Fighter Command to detect incoming German raids early, track them accurately, and deploy squadrons efficiently, often within minutes to spare. Park, commanding 11 Group, oversaw the actual battle, coordinating real-time fighter responses across southern eastern England. Victory in the Battle of Britain stopped Germany's invasion plans cold. It marked the first major defeat of Germany and ensured Britain would remain a base for Allied resistance and future liberation efforts. Churchill embraced the Mediterranean strategy, backing campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy to weaken the Axis and maintain British influence. He famously called Italy the soft underbelly of Europe, believing it would be the easiest route into the continent. Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, supported early Mediterranean operations, but clashed with Churchill over expanding the campaign, warning that Italy's terrain favoured defence and would mire the Allies in costly fighting. He was proven right. Even after Italy's surrender in 1943, German forces entrenched in the mountains turned the campaign into a prolonged grinding struggle. Brooke also opposed Churchill's schemes in the Balkans and the Aegean, fearing they would distract from the decisive front in France. While the Mediterranean campaign brought some strategic gains, post-war analysis generally supports Brooke's view that preserving resources for the cross-channel invasion was key to defeating Germany in Western Europe. By 1942, Britain no longer fought alone. After Germany invaded the USSR in 1941, the Red Army bore the brunt of German power. In December that year, the US entered the war following Pearl Harbor. Lend-Lease shipments from America, food, tanks, planes, sustained Britain even before American troops arrived. Churchill, adept in diplomacy, nurtured a special relationship with Roosevelt, securing vital aid and shaping Allied strategy. He personally crossed the Atlantic multiple times to meet Roosevelt and Stalin, helping hold the fragile Grand Alliance together. Since the soft underbelly of Europe failed to deliver the decisive blow Churchill had hoped for, he eventually accepted the need for a cross-channel invasion. At the Tehran Conference in 1943, he agreed to the timing of Operation Overlord, recognizing that a direct assault on German-occupied France was now essential. Though not involved in the military planning, Churchill played a vital political role. He helped coordinate Allied strategy, backed deception efforts like Operation Bodyguard, and secured crucial support from Parliament and the British public. While he remained skeptical of elements such as Operation Dragoon, the invasion plans of southern France, he ultimately endorsed the overall Allied plan. Churchill recognised Britain's limits. In 1944, he cannily told Parliament, "It is the Russian armies who have done the main work in tearing the guts out of the German army." Victory in 1945 was a shared achievement. British and Commonwealth troops fought bravely, but it was a global industry, Soviet sacrifice, and Allied coordination that sealed German defeat. Was Churchill's leadership decisive or overstated? The answer is both. In 1940, his refusal to negotiate and his ability to embody national defiance made a crucial difference. A weaker leader might have sought terms with Germany. Churchill helped Britain endure until the tide turned. Yet, as the war wore on, his role became one part, albeit a prominent one, of a vast coalition. Churchill's wartime legacy is often seen in two parts. One is the iconic image, the defiant speeches, the V sign, the unyielding symbol of national resolve in 1940. The other is the more complex reality, a gifted political leader whose military instincts were frequently flawed, and whose strategic influence was often checked by his generals and circumstances beyond his control. Churchill played a crucial role in rallying the British people and maintaining political unity, especially during the dark early years of the war. But the notion that Britain would not have survived without him overstates his importance. The endurance and eventual victory of the Allies depended on various array of factors: the Soviet Union's decisive role in the Eastern Front, American support through Lend-Lease, and strategic leadership of British commanders like Dowding and Alan Brooke. Now, before we get into the more controversial aspects, if you enjoyed the video so far, please give it a like, as it can really help small channels like mine grow. And if you want to know more about the topics discussed in this video, check the links in the description for books on the issue. And if you want more odd or less known history, subscribe for more. While Winston Churchill is widely remembered for his wartime leadership in Europe, his legacy in the British Empire is far more troubling. Churchill was not just a statesman, he was a staunch imperialist with a lifelong commitment to colonial dominance and a worldview rooted in racial hierarchy. From India to Iraq to Kenya, the consequences of his beliefs were often catastrophic and deadly. Nowhere is more evident than in India, the crown jewel of the empire. Churchill's early military service on the northwestern frontier reinforced his belief in Britain's mission to rule over lesser peoples. By the 1930s, as leaders like Mahatma Gandhi led mass movements demanding self-rule, Churchill emerged as one of the most fiercest opponents of Indian independence. His disdain for Gandhi was deeply personal and racially charged. He mocked the Indian leader's attire and tactics, saying Gandhi ought to be lain bound hand and foot at the gates of Delhi and trampled on by an enormous elephant. He branded Gandhi a traitor and accused the independence movement, without evidence, of aligning with Britain's enemies during the global war. Churchill's language often portrayed a deep hostility toward Indian culture and its people. His wartime Secretary of State for India, Leo Amory, was appalled by Churchill's outbursts, once recording him as saying he hated Indians and that they are a beastly people with a beastly religion. Amory himself, a conservative and no radical, wrote that Churchill's outlook on India was so extreme he saw little difference between it and the doctrines of racial supremacy that Britain was supposedly fighting against. But Churchill's prejudice didn't stop at words, it influenced policy, most catastrophically during the Bengal famine in 1943. In that year, a devastating food shortage struck Bengal. Millions were at risk, and colonial officials in India appealed to London for emergency aid. Churchill's war cabinet had grain available, Australia even offered shipments, but the British government declined to divert resources. Churchill insisted that ships and supplies be prioritised for Europe, and at one point stockpiled grain for future use rather than sending it to starving civilians. Even more disturbing were Churchill's remarks as the crisis worsened. When told of the mounting death toll, he blamed Indians for breeding like rabbits. Wavell observed that Churchill appeared wholly indifferent to Indian suffering. Between 2 and 3 million people perished, many from starvation, others from diseases that followed. Villagers collapsed in the streets, children were abandoned, people ate leaves and wild grass to survive. While famines had struck colonial India before, this one was made worse by avoidable decisions and racial apathy at the top. Some argue Churchill had no choice, constrained by wartime logistics, but historians have found ample evidence that shipping space and grain supplies existed. The problem wasn't capacity, but will. Churchill's imperial worldview extended far beyond the Indian subcontinent. In 1919, as Secretary of State for War, he confronted unrest in the newly acquired British mandate in Iraq. Arab and Kurdish tribes were resisting British control, and Churchill pushed for the use of chemical weapons to put them down. In official memos, he advocated employing gas on uncivilized tribes, claiming that it would cause a lively terror. He dismissed moral objections, describing critics as squeamish, and argued that gas would have more humane than explosives. The types of gas prepared, such as mustard gas, were anything but mild. Though widespread deployment was ultimately avoided due to logistical issues. British aircraft strafed and bombed villages into submission. The uprising was eventually crushed with brutal force. Though chemical weapons were not used en masse, Churchill's readiness to employ them reflects a constant pattern: imperial security at any cost. This same mindset would re-emerge decades later in Africa. In 1952, Churchill now returned to office in his late 70s. The Mau Mau uprising, launched primarily by members of the Kikuyu ethnic group, sought to reclaim land and dignity stolen through decades of colonial rule. Churchill's government responded with a harsh crackdown. A state of emergency was declared. The colonial administration detained tens of thousands in a network of camps and villages behind barbed wire. Though officially termed rehabilitation centers, these were sites of mass abuse. Detainees were routinely tortured, forced into labor, and subjected to horrific interrogations. Accounts tell of beatings, burnings, sexual violence, and mutilation. Churchill's government portrayed the Mau Mau as savages and terrorists. In truth, the movement was a response to decades of land dispossession, forced labor, and racial injustice. While some Mau Mau fighters committed atrocities, the scale and cruelty of Britain's counterinsurgency dwarfed the rebellion's violence. The goal was to break the will of an entire people. In documents uncovered decades later, colonial officials openly discussed how to sin quietly, a chilling acknowledgement of widespread abuse they knew to be indefensible. The Mau Mau rebellion was eventually defeated, but Kenya gained independence in 1963. The scars, however, endured. In 2013, the British government formally apologised and paid compensation to survivors, an outright admission of the crimes committed under Churchill's administration. These were not isolated incidents. Churchill also supported repressive measures in Malaya during its communist insurgency, and had earlier deployed the Black and Tans to suppress Irish revolutionaries who were subjected to extrajudicial killings and village burnings. Again and again, his instinct was to meet dissent with force, not reform. Underlying all of this was a worldview in which the British, especially Anglo-Saxons, were naturally destined to rule. Churchill made no secret of his belief in racial hierarchy. He once said that granting African colonies self-rule would be ludicrous because the native population have nothing but barbarism. He considered British rule a gift, a civilizing mission that lifted others from savagery. To critics of imperialism, he offered a simple retort: I will not preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. Churchill's convictions were not universally accepted, even in his own time. Colleagues like Amory were shocked, others quietly dissented. The world was changing, anti-colonial movements were rising, and global attitudes towards race and empire were beginning to shift. But Churchill stood firm. He remained, to the end, a proud Victorian imperialist, resolute in a belief system that by the mid-20th century was already collapsing. To assess Churchill's legacy, one must hold two images in mind: the orator who inspired Britain in its darkest hour, and the statesman who presided over starvation, repression, and torture across the empire. One does not cancel out the other, they coexist. If moral worth is measured by the human cost of policy, then the millions who suffered under Churchill's imperial rule weigh heavily on the scale. Churchill remains a figure of immense historical consequence, but if he helped save democracy in Europe, he did so while denying freedom to countless others. He stood for liberty at home and for empire abroad. The contradiction is not incidental, it is the very heart of his legacy. Many argue that Churchill should be judged by the standards of his time, excusing his racism and imperialism as products of a bygone era. But if we apply that logic, shouldn't the same apply to Germany's leadership in the 1930s and 1940s, men also shaped by their context and culture? We rightly reject the rationale for atrocities in Europe, so why excuse similar violence and oppression in the colonies? To apply moral relativism to Churchill but not to others reveals a double standard, one where violence is condemned only when committed in Europe but rationalized when inflicted on colonized people. But even in his own time, many of Churchill's contemporaries viewed his racial and imperial views as extreme and alarming. Leo Amory, Churchill's Secretary of State for India and himself a committed imperialist, was appalled by Churchill's obsessive opposition to Indian self-rule. He famously remarked that Churchill was not quite sane on the subject, and during the Bengal famine exploded in frustration, saying his views were disturbingly close to the authoritarian ideologies they were at war with. Other critics echoed this unease. Richard Casey, the Australian diplomat stationed in India during the war, warned London that Churchill's racist rhetoric and dismissive attitude toward Indian suffering were actively harming Britain's credibility in the colonies and undermining the war effort. Fenner Brockway, a Labour MP and a lifelong anti-imperialist, condemned Churchill's support for violent oppression in Kenya and India, calling his views morally indefensible even by imperial standards. As early as the 1910s, Edie Morrell, the journalist and campaigner against colonial atrocities in Africa, had criticised Churchill's support for coercive labour practices and racial domination, highlighting the deeply rooted white supremacist thinking that shaped Churchill's worldview. To many across the political spectrum, Churchill's attitudes were not simply outdated, they were dangerously out of step with even the norms of his imperialist peers. Churchill did not oppose the German regime because of his racism or belief in racial hierarchy, beliefs he often shared, but because it threatens Britain's dominance in Europe. His opposition was rooted in geopolitics, not universal principles. He upheld liberal democracy for white Europeans while brutally suppressing it elsewhere. The contradiction was obvious to anti-colonial leaders. While Churchill warned of Europe falling into a dark age and championed the four freedoms, he denied those same freedoms to the vast majority of the British Empire's subjects. Jawaharlal Nehru, imprisoned during the war for demanding Indian independence, openly challenged Churchill's rhetoric. He asked, how could Britain claim to fight for liberty in Europe while keeping millions in Asia and Africa under colonial rule? Indeed, Churchill's racial worldview overlapped disturbingly with the regime he opposed. Both believed in the inherent superiority of certain races, the right of powerful nations to dominate weaker ones, and the legitimacy of displacing indigenous peoples in the name of progress. The German concept of Lebensraum, the belief that the superior races had the right to seize land for settlement, echoes the very logic Britain used in Kenya, Rhodesia, and Australia. In Kenya, tens of thousands of Kikuyu were forcibly removed from their land to make room for white settlers. While Germany employed ghettos and concentration camps, Churchill's government during the Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s used detention camps and fortified villages to control the Kikuyu population. Over 1.5 million people were confined in these systems. Forced labour and systemic abuse, including mass sexual violence and public executions, were widely documented by both colonial officials and later historians. Some scholars have characterised the campaign as a form of colonial genocide, yet Churchill fully backed the crackdown, defending it as a necessary measure to maintain imperial control and dismissing critics as naive or subversive. Not only did Churchill oversee a genocide, he also apologised for historic genocides. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, has come in and taken their place. The belief that superior races could replace the indigenous peoples underpinned both imperialism and the genocides of 20th century Europe. One wore armbands and jackboots, the other pith helmets and colonial uniforms. The methods differed, but the ideology, racial entitlement, land theft, and systemic violence was often the same. In much of Africa and Asia, imperialism and fascism appeared as two sides of the same coin. Churchill is praised for defending democracy, but for millions under British rule, his democracy was exclusionary, denied to colonial peoples and upheld through repression. In the end, Churchill was not merely a product of his time. He was an outlier, even in the age of empire, more extreme, more rigid, and more unapologetically racist than many of his peers. Winston Churchill's wartime leadership, especially during Britain's darkest hours in 1940, was undeniably significant, but Churchill's central role in the war has come to eclipse and often whitewash the brutal consequences of his imperial beliefs. He ranked first in the BBC's 100 Greatest Britons poll, a status that suggests not just historical prominence but admiration, someone to look up to. This lionization is no accident. Churchill once quipped, "History would be kind to me, for I tend to write it." And so he did, literally, through his multi-volume memoirs, and symbolically, through the towering image Britain projected of itself after the war, as a beacon of liberty and resistance. But this sanitized version of history conceals the suffering Churchill inflicted on colonized people. The Bengal famine, the Mau Mau genocide, the aerial bombings in Iraq, the repression in Ireland. Churchill's importance during the war is undeniable, but that importance has too often served as a shield against honest appraisal. It has allowed him to be mythologized as a hero beyond criticism, his sins buried beneath granite statues and schoolbook praise. Yet history must be honest, or it becomes propaganda. While Germany has grappled deeply with its fascist past, Britain has largely avoided a reckoning with its imperial legacy. Surveys repeatedly shown that a majority of Britons hold a positive view of the British Empire. According to a 2014 YouGov poll, 59% of Britons believe the Empire is something to be proud of. Which, given the insurmountable crime against humanity the Empire imposed on the world, is shocking. British people should be just as ashamed of their imperial past as Germans are of World War II, and Churchill should be seen as a villainous figure.